Are we witnessing a global direct attack on democracy and the rule of law?
Roughly speaking, 1/3 of the world's population is now ruled by governments that can be described as authoritarian populists.
In countries ruled by populists and autocrats, civil liberties, government critics, and non-governmental organizations are increasingly coming under pressure. Pro-government groups, on the other hand, are growing in strength.
Over the past 15 years or so, we have observed that states are increasingly restricting civil society's scope for action. We are witnessing this phenomenon not only in autocracies, but also increasingly in democracies.
Not only individual activists, but also international NGOs have become targets of those in power. What happens when they are silenced?
Civil society is the raw material of democracy, and if this raw material is lost, it will be very, very difficult to fill democratic processes with democratic content.
Activists are by no means only attacked or arrested. Laws ensure that they are criminalized and deprived of money.
Uwierzcie mi, są nas miliony i jesteśmy wkurzone.
Activists and civil rights campaigners are subject to intimidation. What happens when these voices fall silent? And what can be done to counter this development? India, the world's largest democracy. A rising economic power that needs many raw materials. Environmentalists who draw attention to abuses are coming under increasing pressure. Sand, raw material for cement, walls, windows, computer chips. A multi-billion-dollar business. Since desert sand is not suitable for the production of concrete, the mining of river sand has become as lucrative as it is destructive. Cratered landscapes emerge. Deep holes that lower the water level, eroded riverbeds, and the extinction of species. Ashish Sagar has been documenting the activities of the Indian sand mining industry for 10 years. The mine operators have a license, but Sagar is convinced that they are mining much more sand than permitted and, what's more, using prohibited methods.
You can see dredges all over the place that are prohibited from being used in rivers. They destroy everything, and that is illegal. Here in Bundelkhand, we are frequently faced with droughts. The water shortage is extreme, and the suicide rate among farmers is particularly high. You have to understand, this is all politics.
This sand mine belongs to Dalpat Singh, a member of the ruling BJP party. According to Sagar, he is one of many local politicians who make a lot of money through illegal methods. Sagar's critical voice is not welcome here.
A couple of guys saw us coming. If they see the camera, we'll be in trouble. Hurry up. The people from the mine are following us. Don't stop. Keep going. Keep going. If they catch us, they will shoot at us and destroy our cameras. They have guns and other weapons. They have already attacked me twice.
According to Sagar, the government is aware of the illegal methods, but looks the other way because the business is mostly run by party members. Ashish Sagar produces videos about the environmental crimes of the mine operators for an NGO. He is one of 200 community correspondents who work for video volunteers. On their social media channels, they document social and environmental abuses that no one else is talking about.
We decided that all our correspondents should come from very marginalized communities, because it is marginalized communities who know best what marginalization is. We are not turning camera on to someone. We are turning camera on to ourselves and to our own communities, saying, look, this is who we are.
In a new video, Ashish Sagar wants to document the damage caused by illegal blasting. In this quarry, stones for road construction and natural stones are mined, with the help of a fuse and explosives. Sagar meets a blaster, a day labourer who fears no repercussions. He says everyone in the area, including the police, knows about the illegal methods, but does nothing about it. And so Sagar hears no warning signals and sees no barriers, just many more explosives than are permitted.
तो ये कितनी हैवी ब्लास्टिंग होगी? बटन दबाओ बता देना.
The blaster is ready and coordinates with the miners. Then accidentally, he detonates too soon. This time, no harm was done. A few months earlier, a similar situation led to 3 fatalities. More blasting, deeper blast holes, illegal methods. What's left behind is a trail of devastation in the natural environment. Environmentalists are alarmed.
People no longer appreciate the value of the mountains. They provide us with drinking water and water for agriculture. They feed the lakes, which used to have more water. Today, people are losing their land, their mountains, their forests. If I don't fight for them, who will?
One result of illegal blasting is that groundwater makes its way to the surface. Empty wells and droughts are another consequence. The livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of farmers is at stake. At night, Sagar comes across a caravan of sand trucks transporting the loot to other Indian cities.
Every mine operator has his own guys. Workers from the village or teenagers. They get 500 rupees a day. They look out for police presence and give the go-ahead to the trucks. We can't get out of the car. If these criminals see us, they will run us over. This has happened many times.
Ashish Sagar's research has shown that far too much sand is being mined. That's why the mining operators have been trying to silence the social activist for years.
They want to finish me off. But because they can't just shoot me and bury me, they tried to put me in jail. They wanted to make me disappear, but I won't give up.
Sagar has been sued 8 times, including for resistance to state authority and for spreading fake news, but he has never been convicted. Taking legal action as a means of intimidating environmentalists is popular, not only in India.
In a democracy, when you have dictatorial tendencies, you cannot just kill people because you're a democracy. So you have to find other ways of killing them, metaphorically speaking. So you cut their funds, you make them less desirable, you ignore them, you threaten them, you put false cases on them. Nobody who is power hungry and has dictatorial tendencies would want a community that is questioning.
Critical questions raised by environmentalists and activists are bad for business. That's why the Indian government wants to silence the voices of local NGOs and individual citizens like Ashish Sagar. For international NGOs, there is a further means of exerting pressure: new and stricter laws. More than 50 countries worldwide are restricting NGOs' room for maneuver in this way.
NGO laws are a very popular tool in restricting civil society action. For example, states can enact regulations or laws that make it difficult for organisations to receive funding from within the country or from abroad. States can often expand bureaucracies to the point where it is difficult for an organisation to register or meet its reporting requirements.
The Indian government has tightened and enacted various laws to control NGOs. The most significant one is the Foreign Contribution Act. Since 2014, it has been either prohibited or made virtually impossible for more than 10,000 NGOs to receive foreign funding. The government claims that it is protecting national security. The NGOs, however, suspect that the law is intended to silence them. The Indian branch of Greenpeace has been banned from receiving funds from abroad since 2015. The government accuses Greenpeace of hindering the country's economic growth with its actions. The head of Greenpeace India, Binu Jacob, believes this allegation has been contrived and that the new act and legal disputes are designed to make the NGO's work impossible.
We are an environmental organization, and now a significant part of our energy is dealt in the legal side of, court cases, hearing. That's really not the best use of our resources.
Greenpeace India has been sued repeatedly for years. In 2018, their office was raided by the authorities.
Our bank accounts were frozen for maybe about 2.5, 3 months. We couldn't pay wages, we couldn't pay our salaries. So from a 60-member program campaign team, we were left with only 15 people.
Jacob is certain that Greenpeace India is not in violation of the NGO Act.
The Greenpeace India office is an independent entity which has its own board, the Indian board, which has its own supporters, the Indian supporters. So while we trust and believe on the courts, and we do believe that eventually we will come out of it because we haven't violated the law, but we are aware that it's possible that Greenpeace may be shut down. It has happened to other organizations. It could happen to us.
The NGOs can only defend themselves with perseverance, good lawyers, and a lot of money. Otherwise, they face closure. Just a few hundred meters away is the abandoned office of Amnesty International. The government accused Amnesty of violating anti-terror and foreign funding laws. Raids and seizures followed. Amnesty was forced to suspend its work in India. In 2020, the law on foreign funding was tightened once again. Small, local NGOs in particular are expected to have their funding cut off. It is an attack on the entire organized civil society. What does this mean for India's democracy? Are these laws a targeted political tool of Narendra Modi's government?
Since he won re-election in 2019, the cult of personality has grown rapidly, along with the destruction of independent institutions and with a nakedly majoritarian agenda. So there are three aspects to what is happening in India today: authoritarianism, the cult of personality, and the enforcement of Hindu supremacy over those who are not Hindus.
An organization close to the government, however, has its blessing. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, known as RSS. With nearly 6 million exclusively male members, it has established itself in every sector of society, with the aim of spreading its ideology, especially in schools and universities. The goal? A Hindu state. Its most famous member? President Modi.
So there's the BJP in government, there's the RSS in civil society. The BJP would want to control every aspect of the political process. The RSS would want to control every aspect of the civil society.
The Indian government resorts to legislation to exert pressure on NGOs. Associations like the RSS are designed to create a civil society that plays into the hands of those in power.
There's a big movement of this sort of Hindu nationalism going on, and everybody is involved in that project. Teachers, college professors, scientists, researchers, police officers, advocates. It's not left anyone untouched. So unfortunately, it's become a very polarized us versus them kind of situation. And people like us who are who believe in social justice or human rights or equality or democracy or the constitution, it's much more difficult than what it used to be.
Dissenting voices are no longer heard. Instead, the majority opinion dictates the country's discourse. And it's not only in India that a limited conception of democracy is taking root.
There's a population, a homogeneous population sharing a common set of interests that only needs to be implemented. But this still adheres to the idea of democracy, because it's all about making majority rule possible.
Autocrats rely on social division using the instruments of democracy.
We're in the middle of a dilemma brought on by liberalism. Liberalism means promoting democracy and human rights. But liberalism also includes the right of nations to self-determination, national sovereignty, and the idea that a country can develop on its own without outside interference.
This is precisely the argument that the Modi government uses to prevent the work of international NGOs. Greenpeace and Amnesty International are considered enemies from outside who pursue foreign interests directed against the nation. NGOs advocating for civil rights are thus hampered in their work. Russia has proved itself adept at this method. Since 2012, all non-governmental organizations that are politically active and receive money from abroad have to register as so-called foreign agents. Otherwise, they face fines and closure. The human rights organization Memorial was also added to the foreign agent list in 2016 and thus must be supported by teams from abroad. For example, Anker Giesen in Berlin. Memorial works on coming to terms with Stalinist history and supports current political prisoners. The human rights organization has become a target of government-controlled groups.
Another phenomenon is that there is a fake civil society, so to speak. State agents start civil society organizations, which then pursue the state's aims. They don't do this as state representatives, however, but as civil society organizations. And in this way, the state can then outsource the social developments it wants and say, well, it's all coming from the outside, it's coming from civil society.
Some of the fake NGOs are set up directly by the Ministry of the Interior or the Secret Service. This group targeted a memorial exhibition in 2016.
A few years ago, we had the case of a so-called People's Liberation Movement that set up in front of the building with posters reading, "Memorial is an American spy." Then the whole thing looks like there are members of civil society who oppose Memorial's work. And many of these government-organized NGOs or GONGOs are also pretty violent. You might as well call it uncivilized society.
society.
Attacks like this one on a Putin critic in Moscow are meant to intimidate civil rights activists. The government uses the staged conflicts in its propaganda against the NGOs. Those in power can then call this a conflict between civil society groups and maintain a semblance of democracy.
Since the current government is highly suspicious of uncontrolled social developments, it basically tries to, well, gag civil society without directly abolishing it. Because that wouldn't look good on the international stage. As I mentioned, they want to keep up the appearance of a normal, modern country.
At the same time, Putin makes it clear that he's prepared to fight critical voices by every means possible. The most recent example is Alexei Navalny, Putin's most vocal critic.
The German medics who transported Navalny in this isolation pod obviously did not share the Russian diagnosis of blood pressure problems. While doctors at Berlin's Charité hospital try to save Alexei Navalny's life, his health has become a political and diplomatic issue.
For more, let's bring in Zhana Nemtsova. You know Alexei Navalny and his family personally, and your father was a close friend of his. Who or what do you think is responsible for what happened to him?
Navalny is the most powerful opposition voice in Russia. I think that at least Putin holds political responsibility for his poisoning.
Zhana Nemtsova's father, Boris Nemtsov, served as deputy prime minister under Yeltsin and was in the running to be his successor at points. After Putin's election, Nemtsov quickly became one of his strongest opponents.
I'm essentially a political veteran. I'm not going to have a political career. My goal is to liberate Russia from crooks and thieves, from Putin.
On the 27th of February in 2015, he was crossing the Большой Москворецкий Bridge in front of the Kremlin wall, and while he was walking, he was shot dead. In my opinion, it's a politically motivated assassination, and I doubted that we would have any adequate investigation.
Many Russians agreed, and tens of thousands took to the streets. In memory of her father, Nemtsova founded the Boris Nemtsov Foundation. She received death threats and was forced to go into exile. Based in Prague, Nemtsova's foundation promotes independent journalism and freedom of speech. Returning to Russia is unthinkable for her.
If you want to have an NGO, do not go to Russia, unless you want to cooperate with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia and to have this Gonga organization sponsored by the Russian government.
The government's measures make it nearly impossible for critics to work in Russia. The democratic constitution is merely a facade.
At this point, you can't really call Russia a democracy anymore. Although it continues to maintain this appearance on the outside by having a parliament that passes laws, a judiciary, a constitutional court, all these institutions are in fact being undermined.
Without a critical civil society, a democracy cannot function. But for Putin, it's enough to know that he has majority support.
If Russia had a totally free election in 4 weeks' time, Putin could win it regardless. With each additional term in office, the political system's tendency to renew the victory of these authoritarian populists becomes more entrenched.
Even governments within the European Union are increasingly reining in civil society. Poland is one example. The right-wing populist party Law and Justice, PiS, has been in power here since 2015. It has noticeably changed the country's political climate. The party leader Kaczynski preaches traditional family values. The government strongly rejects a liberal attitude towards homosexuality. Abortion laws have been tightened, and NGOs that fight for women's rights are being deprived of funding. This is a severe blow, particularly to organizations like BABA, which fight for a liberal abortion law and help victims of sexual violence by providing psychological counseling and legal aid. Anita Kucharska-Dziedzic founded BABA in 1999 because, as a victim of violence herself, she received no professional help. Due to the nature of their work, BABA's employees are regularly checked by the police, and their office has been searched. Only one telephone consultant is courageous enough to appear on camera. Kucharska-Dziedzic uses her immunity as a member of parliament to speak her mind about the recent tightening of the abortion ban.
Mr. Deputy Marshal, Upper House, with its so-called verdict, the so-called Constitutional Tribunal has mistreated Polish women and deprived them of their dignity and human rights.
In 2017, the government established the National Freedom Institute, which manages all government funds intended for NGOs. This makes it possible to regulate who receives money and who doesn't. Controlling critical voices, here again by means of funding.
Catholic fundamentalists are increasingly influencing the government. This is why we no longer receive government funding, not even the money intended for NGOs. We simply live off donations.
Since many feminist organizations have been deprived of funding, privately organized protests are becoming louder. Kucharska-Dziedzic supports these protests and grassroots campaigns. At this fashion show, a women's group seeks to highlight how victims of sexual violence are blamed for their clothing in order to relativize the guilt of the male perpetrators.
Uwierzcie mi, są nas miliony i jesteśmy wkurzone. Pochodzimy z Dąbrowy Górniczej, z Poznania, z Katowic.
Officially, Poland is one of the 10 safest countries for women in the world. However, a rape is not recorded if the woman has drunk alcohol. Multiple rapes in a marriage count as one incident.
Ja również zostałam zgwałcona i to nie jest mój wstyd. Mamy dość chowania się.
Campaigns like these challenge the image of the ideal family and woman propagated by the government.
Every time we talk about women's rights or rights for victims of violence, the state accuses us of destroying Polish traditions and the sanctity of the Polish family, and of spreading LGBT and gender ideology. That is their only argument.
The peace government is succeeding in its strategy of defending traditional values and role models. NGOs that jeopardize these achievements continue to face new laws intended to limit their influence. Adam Bodnar is resisting this. The Commissioner for Human Rights may bring any bill to the Constitutional Court that he deems unlawful. Despite opposition from the peace government, he is still in office in early 2021.
It has become evident that this government doesn't just have mildly authoritarian tendencies. They don't bend the rules just a little, while otherwise being tolerable. Instead, they want to decide what kind of country we live in, and under what conditions. And the people don't agree to that.
Bodnar therefore files lawsuits against bills he considers unlawful and advocates for the rights of minorities. He sees his country as politically adrift.
On the one hand, we're a member of the European Union, so a certain standard is expected. On the other hand, we find ourselves ashamed of Poland more and more often. By this I mean that the Catholic Church has an enormous influence on Polish politics. And of course they have really inflamed the atmosphere in the discourse around LGBT people. Church representatives could be heard saying things like, "These people are contagious," and that aligns with the party's policies.
In Poland, the government and Catholic Church are unified under values that permit only one traditional way of life.
The fundamental idea that there is a homogeneous society with a fixed will, which only has to be implemented into majority rule, always presupposes that this homogeneous group of citizens also has relatively clear external boundaries.
Isolation and exclusion, directed above all at minorities. The LGBT community in particular is targeted by those in power.
Czerwona zaraza już po naszej ziemi na szczęście nie chodzi. Co wcale nie znaczy, że nie ma nowej. Nie czerwona, ale tęczowa.
Jeżeli przypomnimy sobie nazistów, którzy
If we remember the Nazis, who hated and wanted to annihilate Jews, homosexuals, the mentally ill, and communists, people are being hounded in a similar way right now.
Tak w tej chwili mamy podobną nagonkę. Fundamentaliści religijni nienawidzą.
Religious fundamentalists hate feminists, equality, and non-heteronormative people, which means everyone who deviates from the norm.
Od tego, co kiedyś Rosjanie nazywali
They want a person without characteristics, who is completely absorbed by the state's ideology.
I jest absolutnie lepiony przez ideologię państwową.
Online propaganda videos fuel the atmosphere. They show ultra-conservative organizations that vilify LGBT people as dangerous, especially to children. This has consequences. In 2020, around a third of Poland's provinces and municipalities declared themselves free of so-called LGBT ideology. Although these declarations are primarily symbolic, they trigger violence and hatred. Assaults occur throughout Poland, but no statistics are recorded. A driving force in the battle over values and traditional role models is the Ordo Juris Institute for Legal Culture, a think tank that has championed ultra-conservative women's and LGBT policies for years. The symbol of Polish resistance during World War II is enthroned symbolically on its building. Ordo Juris believes the country is under threat.
Głównym celem Instytutu Ordo Juris jest obrona zarówno na forum krajowym.
Ordo Juris defends the values that have lately been pushed out of the public debate.
Często są w jakiś sposób
LGBT ideology strives to lump together all those who struggle with various disorders in their gender identity or with certain tendencies, for example.
zaburzeniami tożsamości płciowej.
It seeks to turn them into a class of people who stand in opposition to the rest of society.
Zrobić z nich jakąś taką klasę ludzi w opozycji do...
That's why we oppose this radical movement.
W tym sensie tym radykalnym ruchom się sprzeciwiamy.
Ordo Juris has an enormous influence on the government and society. Its co-founder, Aleksander Stępkowski, is the spokesman for the Polish Supreme Court.
According to our calculations, more than 30 people from Ordo Juris are closely connected to the highest political power in Poland. They work in the ministries, the presidential palace, or the judicial and legislative bodies. As a result, they can more easily influence the state and intimidate the population.
In October 2020, the Polish Constitutional Court further tightens the already strict abortion law. Abortion is now prohibited even if a fetus is severely deformed or has an incurable disease. The expert opinion on this ruling comes from Ordo Juris.
Jeżeli chodzi o wyrok Trybunału Konstytucyjnego, to Ordo Iuris...
Like every other NGO in Poland, Ordo Iuris was able to make a statement.
swojej opinii.
We did this as a friend of the court, so to speak.
Na piśmie, właśnie opinii jako
We consider this ruling a major step towards safeguarding human rights in our country.
krok w stronę pełnej realizacji praw człowieka w naszym
The fact that so many people are denied their right to life simply because of a disability, illness, or developmental disorder is not consistent with human rights.
O niepełnosprawność, o wady rozwojowe jest niedopuszczalne.
However, many see this ruling as anything but a victory for human rights. Anita Kucharska-Dziedzic and her fellow campaigners are also preparing for demonstrations. They are inspired by Argentinian feminists who recently won a liberalization of abortion law after a 30-year fight. Like them, they wear green scarves at their protests.
To jest symbol strajku, chustka jest symbolem strajku, to jest symbol wszystkich kobiet.
Mi się ryczeć chce, jak ja myślę, nie? Że
Ale
wyjdziemy
wiesz co,
na
jak
ulicę.
zobaczysz ten
Ale
film...
nie
słyszałaś tego? Ten performance jest po prostu niesamowity.
Gwałcicielem jesteś ty! Policja! Wszystkie religie! I nasza władza! Nie chcecie tego widzieć? Co spotyka wiele z nas?
Jeszcze wam powiem, dziewczyny, mówię, ciary.
Się musi rozlać po polsku.
I to się rozleje, zobaczycie, że się rozleje.
Civil society in Poland remains outspoken. Criticism of Russia, however, is driving more and more people into exile. The journalist Ali Feruz also had to leave for Germany. Feruz wrote for the Moscow newspaper Novaya Gazeta, Russia's main independent newspaper. He knew how things worked in the country.
When I'm working like a journalist and at Novaya Gazeta, I always know that my life is in danger. Few of my colleagues were murdered and attacking to journalists. It's often happening.
In the last 10 years alone, 5 journalists and 1 lawyer working with Novaya Gazeta have been murdered. Feruz wrote about migration and minorities, inflammatory topics in Russia. He knew that criticizing the government could become dangerous.
I was going to have my vocal lesson, and the police close to there, they were waiting for me, and when they saw me, they like, oh, this one.
Hey, I've been arrested, and now I'm being taken to the police station. I was arrested by Lieutenant Kalashnikov. Badge number 017889.
Ali Feruz has Russian parents, but was born in Uzbekistan. According to Russian law, this entitles him to Russian citizenship. He had applied for this, but not yet received it.
After some of my articles, the Russian security services catch me, and officially they were telling me that they got I'm illegal in Russia. Yeah, but I was legal and I had all documents and everything.
This is not about him, nor about us. The point is that the intelligence agencies are collaborating. The Uzbek generals told the Russian generals, "We want this guy." And the Russians said, "No problem." The Secret Service has in fact started to assume the government's role in society, hunting down opposition members.
While the editorial office in Moscow fights for his release, Feruz also receives support from Berlin. The journalist Daria Gomelskaya, a friend of Feruz, immediately grasps the situation.
This is not about someone being in prison. This is a matter of life and death. With Ali, it was about his deportation to Uzbekistan. And it was clear to me from day one, if that happens, I will never see him alive again.
Ali Feruz is homosexual, which is a punishable offence in Uzbekistan. He says that if he were deported, he would face imprisonment and torture, as was the case when he fell into the hands of the Uzbek Secret Service in his early 20s.
They're putting needles between nails and skin. It's very painful. And they're putting like hot water on you, or putting you to the water with chlor. Yeah, they're just not killing you, but giving you too much pain, which is like really close to die.
Daria Gomelskaya knew that Ali Feruz would not subject himself to torture again.
I was sitting there alone, and at first I was stunned and powerless. And then I made phone calls all over the world, in Germany too. That's how his friends joined forces. And by the next day, in fact, we had already registered a protest in front of the Russian embassy and stood there with loudspeakers and megaphones and tried to attract as much attention as possible for the cause.
Feruz's employer, Novaya Gazeta, also launched a campaign to free him from prison. As a result, the case was reported on by many international newspapers. Gomelskaya was also successful. Solidarity actions took place in Germany, Russia, and other countries.
As soon as a media presence emerges, well, let's just say that fewer atrocities take place. As soon as someone is watching and talking about it loudly, there is a chance that the person might survive, or even get out in the end.
After 6 months of international protests, the Russian Supreme Court overturned the decision to deport Feruz to Uzbekistan. The astonishing reason: a foreign citizen may not be detained indefinitely. With the help of the Red Cross, Feruz departs for Germany. Here he receives refugee status. To this day, it remains unclear why Feruz was arrested. He suspects that a critical article about the Uzbek president was responsible.
Working as a journalist is for me like a mission. It's very important to give sensitive and important information to society, to react, to reflect, and to start changes in this society.
Feruz's case and his departure fit into the rhetoric of the Russian rulers. Their propaganda speaks of Europe as Gayrup.
Gayrup is this buzzword used to describe the enemy on the outside. According to the Russian narrative, Europe is this Sodom and Gomorrah. In Europe, everyone is gay, and that will bring about Europe's downfall. This narrative has been told in Russia for years, since Putin's been in power, in fact, that a danger is looming. And this is a danger from the outside, Russia against the rest of the world.
Putin paints Europe and the LGBT movement as Russia's adversaries. He offers his followers protection against these alleged enemies lurking in and outside the country.
This is an attribute of all these movements. They identify various groups which will then be excluded. In doing so, they address the more deep-set emotions of loss of status, of the family and the man, which actually have nothing to do with equality politics.
Many critical voices are in exile, such as the journalist Zhana Nemtsova. Through her seminars, she aims to support colleagues who still work in Russia. In these courses, experienced journalists teach their younger colleagues how to report independently.
Now we have a big assault on journalism, and Putin understands it perfectly well, because when he became president, the first thing he was focused on was to fight with independent TV channels. He actually wanted to gain control over national television stations. They now serve the interests of the state. So he understands how important journalism is, because the word might be very, very powerful.
Nemtsova wants to use these courses to encourage her colleagues in their work. The Russian government sees independent reporting as opposition and treats journalists accordingly.
Navalny retweeted my interview. Can you imagine? Now that's what I call a success.
In some Russian regions, there are no independent media outlets at all. Zero. And Alexei Navalny, who is Russia's leading opposition politician, he actually created a network of offices across Russia. And in some regions, Navalny's offices are the only independent source of information.
Navalny uses his social media channels to expose abuses and criticize the Russian government. The young liberal generation inform themselves through his channels. Navalny knows that his opposition policies are only credible if he operates from within Russia. This is why he flies back to Moscow in January 2021, despite the risk to his life. He's arrested while still at the airport and sentenced to 3.5 years in a prison camp. Around the world, the consensus is that Navalny was imprisoned unjustly. But how is this criticism viewed in Russia?
The problem that is often encountered is that these measures are met with approval in the general population. If the population is on the side of the government when it acts restrictively, we can hardly say that these actions are not democratic.
The Indian government is also trying to undermine the rights of citizens by so-called democratic means. In September 2020, Parliament passes a controversial agricultural reform. There will no longer be a minimum price guarantee for products. Instead, the market will set the price. While part of the population supports the new laws, the activist and environmentalist Ashish Sagar considers them undemocratic.
The media claims that democracy is alive, but in reality they don't even want anyone to protest. The government has hijacked the media and the judicial system and stopped journalists from speaking out.
But civil society in India has not yet been silenced. Countless farmers who are angry at the government make their way to Delhi in late 2020. Many farmers in India live on or below the poverty line. More than 300,000 of them have committed suicide in the last 25 years. Now their last safeguard, the minimum price guarantee, has collapsed. The farmers fear that the corporations now dictating prices will exploit them even more.
जो देश के लिए तानाशाही कर रहे हैं और देश के ऊपर थोप रहे हैं, किसान जो है वो बिल्कुल नहीं इनकी चलने देगा, ना हम चलने देंगे। हम बना रहे हैं ये कानून। किसान के अगर प्रॉफिट में होता तो किसान सड़कों पे क्यों रुलता?
The farmers have organized their protest without official associations, using WhatsApp groups to get the message out. More than 60% of India's population of 1.3 billion work in agriculture. In early 2021, the Supreme Court temporarily suspended the law and the government offered an 18-month moratorium. The protesters rejected the offer and want to stay until the laws are abolished. The protests have become a turning point for democracy in India. Modi has independent journalists arrested and cuts off the farmers' internet access, but the protests continue to grow. They are the largest demonstrations since Narendra Modi came to power, perhaps the biggest ever. It's a victory for civil society. In Russia too, tens of thousands of people take to the streets after Alexei Navalny is arrested.
Russian people are not those people who would like to have an autocrat. They don't want to have Putin forever. It's too much.
In Poland, the Constitutional Court's ruling virtually banning abortion has proved to be the final straw. For months, people have been demonstrating in Warsaw and beyond.
The government probably expected a few thousand here, a couple of hundred there, a few days, and that's it. But it turned out that these protests are much bigger, if not the biggest since 1989.
To those in power, the protests are nothing but hysteria. For the young generation and civil society, they could be a reason for hope.
Civil societies have power. They can really make things happen. And this has worried a lot of dictators and autocracies all over the world. They've realized civil, organized action can pose a threat to us.
They're the agents of democracy. Civil rights activists, NGOs, everyday citizens. Their protest symbolizes the power of ordinary people, the foundation of civil society.